You know, every country's economy is built on some kind of big idea, a master plan. Today, we're going to dig into the powerful socialist blueprint that Israel's founders used to build its economy, right from scratch. Okay, so let's just think about this for a second. Imagine you get to build a new country. A total blank slate. You've got to create an entire economy. What's your guiding philosophy? What's the big idea? Well, let's dive into the very specific answer that Israel's founders came up with.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the big economic ideas that were floating around at the time. Then we'll zoom in on the socialist path Israel took, see what that actually looked like in the early years, and wrap up by connecting it all to where the country's economy is today.
So, first things first, Israel's economy didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, from the moment the state was founded back in 1948, its economic path was very deliberately shaped by a really powerful guiding ideology.
And this is the key. The folks actually building the state, setting up all the institutions, they were from parties like Mapai and Mapam, the workers' parties. So for them, socialist beliefs, that wasn't just an option on the table. It was more like the default setting, the factory settings for the whole new nation's economy.
To really get why they went this route, we kind of have to understand the three big economic isms that were competing on the world stage back then. You can think of them as three totally different operating systems for running a country.
Okay, so on one extreme, you've got communism. Just picture the Soviet Union. Here, the state is everything, and I mean everything. There's no private property, the government owns all the resources and is in charge of handing them out equally to everybody.
Then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have pure capitalism. In this world, the free market is king. The government's role is hands-off. It's kind of a survival of the fittest model, with absolutely no state guarantee for things like welfare, housing, or a job. And this chart just lays it out so clearly. The huge difference really comes down to state control versus private ownership. On one side, the state owns and plans everything for the good of the group. On the other, it's all about private individuals driving the economy in a free market.
And then, wedged right in the middle, you have this third way, socialism. Think of it as a hybrid. You can still own private property, absolutely. But, and this is a big but, the state steps in a major way to make sure there's a strong social safety net. It's committed to ensuring everyone's basic needs are met.
You can see these different models playing out all over the world, right? The Soviet Union was the textbook example of communism. For socialism, you think of places like Sweden or France with their strong welfare states. And of course, the United States is the classic example of a capitalist, market-driven economy. So, you have these three options on the table. Which way did Israel's founders go? Well, for them, it was a no-brainer.
See, for them, the main goal wasn't just about building up wealth. Their North Star, their entire vision, was to create a society based on as much equality as humanly possible. That was priority number one.
So where did this intense focus come from? Well, it was a mix of things. A big part was their own experience in the kibbutz movement. Then there was their political dominance as the workers' parties. They even drew some inspiration from Soviet social concepts, not the politics but the social ideas. At the end of the day, it all came together in this powerful desire to build a true welfare state. And this is so important. They weren't just dreamers working from a textbook. They had a living, breathing laboratory for these socialist ideals right there, the kibbutz. It was a small-scale society where everyone pitched in, everyone worked, and everyone got what they needed. Shared food, shared housing, the whole deal. The big idea was, hey, what if we could scale this up for the whole country?
Okay, so what does it actually look like when you try to build an entire nation based on this socialist blueprint? Let's take a look at how they put these ideas to work during Israel's first couple of decades.
This period, from 48 to 66, is known as the directed economy. And that name says it all, really. This was an economy that was actively steered and managed by the government, not just left to the whims of the market.
So how did this work in practice? Well, this whole system basically rested on four huge pillars. First, you had central planning. The government was calling the shots on where the money went. Second, massive state intervention in, well, pretty much everything. Third, most of the big companies were actually owned by the government. And fourth, and this is a really unique one, you had Histadrut. This was a labor union, but it was so powerful it was also a major employer, itself owning banks and factories, the whole shebang.
This table just makes it so incredibly clear. The state wasn't just a referee on the sidelines, it was the star player, on the field in every position. Building and handing out housing, that was the state. Running the major industries, state again. The number one employer in the country, you guessed it, the government was the absolute center of gravity for all economic activity.
All right, let's pull all these threads together. What's the lasting impact of this socialist foundation? How does it continue to shape Israel today?
Here's the bottom line. Those first 18 or so years weren't just some passing phase. They actually forged the country's economic DNA. This deep-rooted idea of state intervention and a strong social safety net got hardwired into the system, and it's influenced how the economy has developed ever since.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? This brings us to a huge question for today. How does that old legacy, that DNA of a state-managed economy, affect modern challenges? I'm talking about things like Israel's famously high cost of living. Is that deep-seated belief in state intervention a help, or is it a hindrance when you're competing in a 21st century global market? That's really the tension we're left with.
All right, welcome back. Today, we're diving into what is honestly one of the most incredible economic stories of the 20th century. We're talking about how the brand new state of Israel, against pretty much all odds, managed to even build an economy in its first few years of existence. So this really is the central question, isn't it? And this isn't just some thought experiment. This was the cold, hard reality facing Israel's leaders. Just try to imagine it. Your country's population more than doubling in just a handful of years. How on earth do you feed everyone? Where do they live? What jobs do they do? I mean, it sounds completely impossible. Okay, so to understand how they even began to tackle this, you've got to look at the vision they had. See, the founders weren't just building a country, they were trying to build an entire economy from the ground up. And it was all based on a very specific set of ideals. And you can see here how it all kind of fits together. The ideology at the time was deeply socialist, and that meant the government was in the driver's seat for, well, pretty much everything. It was central planning, pure and simple. And what was their number one, top-of-the-list priority? Agriculture. They set up all these new settlements, you've probably heard of the kibbutzim, all with one single-minded goal, food security. The nation absolutely had to be able to feed itself. That was job one. But that idealistic vision was about to slam head-on into a monumental challenge. A literal human wave was heading for Israel's shores, and it was going to test this young state to its absolute breaking point. And to really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this challenge, you just have to look at the numbers. On one side, you have this tiny, brand new nation, and on the other, this absolutely unprecedented wave of immigration. The math is just staggering. So get this, in 1948, when Israel was founded, the entire population was only 600,000 people. That's it. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than a lot of cities are today. Then, boom, by 1955, just 7 years later, they had taken in nearly 1 million new immigrants. Let that sink in for a second. The population didn't just grow, it exploded. It more than doubled. And this wasn't some slow, gradual thing. This was an all-out emergency. Well, the result was completely inevitable, right? A critical shortage of, well, everything. Not enough houses, not enough jobs, and most importantly, not enough food. You just couldn't feed that many people. So what do? What does a government do when faced with a situation like that? Israel's answer was a really drastic policy. It was known as the Tzena, which translates to the austerity period. The whole idea behind Sina was actually pretty simple. If there isn't enough to go around for everybody, then you have to control what everybody gets. It was a policy of radical rationing, and it was designed to make sure that every single family, whether they were new arrivals or had been there for a while, got an equal share, even if that share was, painfully small. And this quote right here just illustrates the logic perfectly. It's so simple and stark. You've only got 10 eggs, but 20 families. So what do? You ration. Everybody gets their share. This wasn't about getting rich or prosperity. It was about survival, and it was about fairness. The government basically decided, look, it's better for everyone to have a little than for some people to have a lot while others starve. And this wasn't some short-term fix they did for a few months. Official rationing kicked off in 1949 and didn't really fully end for almost a decade. For a whole generation of Israelis, this state of austerity, this was just normal life. It was their economic reality. So what did that actually look like day to day? Well, this policy touched literally every part of life. You got coupons for your food and other basic goods. The government controlled all the resources, and they slammed the brakes on imports. Now, part of that was to get local production going, but the biggest reason was to save every last bit of foreign currency for the most critical thing of all, national security. But here's the thing. even with all that rationing, it just wasn't enough. The country was teetering on the brink. They desperately needed cash, real capital, to build things like roads and factories and create jobs. A lifeline had to come from somewhere else. And that lifeline ended up coming from two main places. First, you had loans from the American Jewish community. This was the Israel Bonds Program, and it was an absolutely incredible source of money for development. The second source, though, was much, much more complicated. We're talking about reparations from West Germany for the Holocaust. Now, this decision to take money from Germany, you have to understand, this was one of the most painful, most divisive issues in Israel's early history. For so many people, especially Holocaust survivors, the idea of taking what they called blood money was just unthinkable. There were huge protests. It really threatened to tear the country apart. But the prime minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, he took a very pragmatic, long-term view. He basically argued that this money was absolutely essential for the survival and the growth of the state, the very state that was now the home for the people who had suffered so much. It was a gut-wrenching, almost impossible choice, but he was convinced it was what they had to do to build a future. So when you look back, Israel's early years were just defined by these impossible choices, right? A constant tug of war between ideology and sheer necessity, between the past and the future. And it kind of leaves you with a question for today, doesn't it? What are the impossible decisions that are shaping Israel's economy right now? All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to talk about something pretty wild, one of the most dramatic economic turnarounds in modern history. We're looking at how Israel pulled itself back from the very brink of financial collapse to become the tech powerhouse we know today. Imagine this number, 450%. Now, back in the early 1980s, that wasn't some crazy stock market gain. No, that was Israel's annual inflation rate. It was a full-blown economic crisis, and it was spiraling completely out of control. So what does that even mean? Life under hyperinflation? Well, it's a total nightmare. It means your life savings just gone. Poof! Vanishing before your very eyes as the price of bread and milk skyrockets every single day. The whole economy was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Something big had to be done. So you've got this economic monster on the loose. How in the world do you stop it? Well, in 1985, a national unity government led by Shimon Peres, along with key players like Finance Minister Itzhak Modai and the head of the central bank, Michael Bruno, basically said, okay, enough is enough. They knew it was time for drastic action. And their answer was the 1985 Economic Stabilization Plan. Now, this wasn't just some minor policy tweak. Oh no. This was a bold, all-out, three-pronged attack designed to go right for the throat of hyperinflation and tame that beast once and for all. So what did this attack actually look like? Well, it was a direct assault. First, they slammed the brakes on and froze all prices, everywhere. Then, they made some really deep cuts to the government's budget to cool the whole economy down. And, maybe most importantly, they shut off the money printers that were just pouring gasoline on the fire. And the results? Honestly, they were nothing short of an economic miracle. Just look at this. In a single year, inflation just plummeted from that insane 450% all the way down to a much more manageable 20%. I mean, that's a stunning, almost unbelievable success. Okay, so the big question is, why did this work when all the other attempts had failed? Well, the people behind the plan, they realized something absolutely crucial. You can't just treat one symptom. You have to treat all the problems together. It had to be a package deal. And this table really breaks down the genius of that package deal approach. They didn't just pick one thing. They went after all three root causes of the inflation at the exact same time. You had too much money chasing too few goods? Boom, budget cuts. Raw material costs going up? Freeze the prices. And the big one, everyone expecting prices to keep rising, they hit them with a decisive all-in plan that completely changed public belief. That, right there, was the secret sauce. And you know, this wasn't just a win for Israel. It became a global blueprint for how to fight hyperinflation. Professor Brunos, one of the architects of the plan, was suddenly getting calls from all over the world, even advising countries like Argentina on how to tackle their own crises. But here's the thing. Taming inflation, that was just Act 1. It was the critical first step that created the stability for something much, much bigger, a complete transformation of Israel's entire economic philosophy, from a closed-off system to an open one. So what does that look like? Well, for starters, the government started getting out of the way. They launched this huge wave of privatizations. We're talking massive state-owned companies, like the biggest banks, chemical companies, you name it, getting sold off to private owners.
And it wasn't just selling companies. At the same time, they started tearing down the economic walls that had kept the country isolated. They slashed tariffs, they signed these huge free trade agreements with the US and Europe, and just like that, Israel went from being a small, closed economy to a real player on the world stage.
So, okay, we're moving into the 1990s now. And this new, stable, open economy, it created the perfect conditions, like fertile ground for a brand new engine of growth to fire up. And that engine was, of course, high-tech. But here's what's so important to understand. Israel becoming a startup nation was no accident. It was this incredible convergence, a perfect storm, really. You had the stability from the '85 reforms, the internet was just starting to boom globally, you had this massive influx of skilled talent, and then some really smart government foresight. And when I say smart government foresight, I mean they even started acting like a venture capital firm. They created this fund called Yozma back in '94, and its whole job was to use public money to invest in promising new tech startups. I mean, think about that. For that time, that was a totally pioneering move, basically seeding a whole industry from scratch. But all the stability and investment in the world doesn't mean much without the right people. And maybe the most critical ingredient in this whole story was the human factor. In the 90s, over 1 million immigrants came pouring in from the former Soviet Union. And these weren't just new people looking for jobs. They were highly educated engineers, doctors, scientists. They were the brain power, the fuel for this brand new high-tech sector. But they also had a second, huge effect. They were new consumers. They needed houses, food, services, creating this massive boost in domestic demand that drove growth from the ground up. It was a 2-for-1 economic miracle. It's amazing, really. The impact of those tough decisions back in 1985 is still paying off. Those reforms built a financial system so strong, so resilient that when the 2008 global financial crisis hit and wrecked economies everywhere, Israel's banking sector basically just sailed right through it. So when you step back and look at the whole story, it's just extraordinary. From a 450% inflation nightmare to a global tech powerhouse, it's an incredible lesson in economic transformation. Which, of course, leaves us with one final big question to chew on. The 1985 plan fixed the past and built the present, but after decades of riding that high-tech wave, what's going to be Israel's next growth engine? Welcome! Today, we're diving into the modern Israeli economy. And let me tell you, it's a story of, well, explosive growth, some absolutely game-changing discoveries, and, of course, the kind of unique challenges that only come when you're really successful. So we're really digging into 2 big questions here. First, how on earth did Israel become the startup nation that everyone talks about? And maybe even more important, what's next? We're going to look at the growing pains, the future tests for an economy that has just changed so fast. We'll chart the whole course, right from the year 2000 up to today. All right, here's our game plan. First up, the 2000s, the totally chaotic birth of the tech boom. Then we'll jump to the 2010s, a decade of stabilization and a massive energy discovery. After that, we'll get into the tricky challenges of right now, the 2020s. And to wrap it all up, we'll take a peek at what the future might hold. Okay, let's start our story back in the 2000s. And I mean, this was a time of absolute frenzy. Seriously, if you sat in a cafe, all you would hear was people buzzing about startups, investments, the next big idea. The ambition was just off the charts, but so was the volatility. It was a wild ride. You know, every big movement needs that one spark, right? The thing that ignites it all. For Israel's tech scene, that spark was one single massive event. Just one sale from one company that showed an entire generation of entrepreneurs what was actually possible. It just completely lit up the entire country's imagination. And this is the number that did it. $400 million. Can you believe that? That was the price tag for Mirabilis, the company behind that old-school instant messenger ICQ. Back then, that figure was just mind-blowing. It sent this crystal-clear message, hey, you can build something right here in Israel and sell it for an absolute fortune. And just like that, everyone wanted to be the next Mirabilis. So you got to ask, how did this all come together? Well, it was like a perfect storm of different factors. You had foreign investment just pouring in. The government got smart and adopted what's called the Irish model, basically using big incentives to get giants like Intel to set up shop. The universities were churning out new ideas. But the real secret sauce, the thing that made Israel different, it was the spillover from its advanced military. So much of that groundbreaking tech and honestly the best talent, especially in stuff like cybersecurity, came straight out of the defense sector. But listen, it was not a straight lineup, not at all. This decade was a total roller coaster. The whole craze hit its peak in 2000, but then bam, the global .com bubble burst in 2002, and it felt like all the air just got sucked out of the room. The whole sector got hammered. And yet, amazingly, by 2004, it was already bouncing back, and strong. It really proved how resilient this thing was. All right, so let's move into the 2010s. The story really starts to evolve here. This decade is really about two big things. First, learning from past mistakes to build some real financial stability. And second, a discovery that was, well, completely unexpected and would literally change the country's future.
Okay, this is actually a fascinating piece of the story. Think about it. When the 2008 global financial crisis hit, right? Economies everywhere were just devastated. But Israel? It stayed remarkably stable. And you have to ask why. Well, it's because it had already been through its own terrible banking crisis way back in 1983. The lessons they learned from that pain were brutal, but they led to super strict regulations and a really robust banking system. So decades later, that system was tough enough to handle the global shock. It's kind of like what the whole world had to learn the hard way in 2008, Israel had already learned back in '83. So just as the economy is proving how solid it is, something else is happening. Out at sea. You could call it a bonus prize. Prospectors hit the jackpot. They discovered these enormous natural gas fields. You might have heard of them, Tamar and Leviathan. And this was an absolute game changer. And what did that discovery lead to? A concept that for Israel was pretty much unthinkable before: energy independence. I mean, for the first time ever, the country had its own massive source of energy. This dramatically cut its reliance on foreign imports and gave it this huge economic and strategic advantage. It's hard to overstate how big a deal this was.
I love this quote because it just perfectly captures the whole gas deal story. See, the government set a fixed price for the gas, and at the time, a lot of critics were screaming, saying it was way too high. But then what happened? Global energy prices went through the roof, and Israel was locked into that original, now much lower price. It turned out to be an absolutely fantastic deal for the country, and it was almost completely by accident. And that brings us right up to today, the 2020s. And this is where the story really shifts, because all that incredible success from the last 20 years, it's created a whole new set of problems that are, in a lot of ways, way more complex to solve. So the decade kicks off with the massive global shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The government had to respond with these huge aid programs, which meant the national deficit went up. But through all that chaos, there was one sector that basically acted as the engine for the entire economy. Even with the global downturn, the high-tech sector stayed strong. And that's what allowed Israel's economy to bounce back way faster than a lot of other places. And just look at this. The role of high-tech in the economy is just immense. I mean, it's almost disproportionate. It's really become the undisputed heavyweight champion. But, when you have one champion that's that dominant, it's not always without some serious side effects. So yeah, the high-tech sector is driving this incredible growth, but that forces us to ask a really critical question. What's the social price for all this success? Because when you concentrate so much wealth in one place, it's bound to create some new, tricky challenges. And here they are, the three big ones. First, you've got these enormous wage gaps. It's creating what people call a two-tiered society. You've got those in high tech, and then you've got everyone else. Second, the infrastructure just can't keep up. The traffic congestion is just choking the country. I'm not kidding. A drive that should take 40 minutes can easily turn into 2.5 hours. It's strangling productivity. And finally, there's this growing awareness that all this growth has to be sustainable. People are focusing more on green tech and being environmentally responsible. Okay, so let's wrap this up by looking ahead. How is the economy adapting to a world that's becoming more digital, literally by the day? Well, for one thing, the pandemic hit the fast forward button on remote work, and that completely changed the labor market. So in response, there's this huge push to invest in upskilling the workforce for the jobs of tomorrow. We're talking a heavy focus on fields like AI and data science,
everything needed to make sure the country stays on that cutting edge.
And that leaves us with one final and I think absolutely critical question. You've got the innovation, you've got the talent, you've got the money. It's all there. But can the country's physical infrastructure, we're talking roads, public transit, all of it, can it actually keep up with these soaring economic ambitions? That right there might be the biggest challenge for the years to come.